for coming back. Thanks for not building a bonfire in the room to stay warm. I am moderating again because poor Tom Calloway has some kind of illness and is not up to his usual speed. So I'm going to cover here as well. So the title is fairly clear. OSPOs in academia are very new, and just as they said in the corporate panel, they're all very different. So we thought we'd bring a group of folks together to talk about that. So we have Mike Nolan, who is at Open at RIT, and we have Kendall, who has been at the University of Vermont for about 30 seconds in his role, and Stephanie, who's been in her role for 120 seconds. And so they're going to do what they can to tell you about what they're doing and what they hope to do. So Mike, as the oldest serving OSPO person here, why don't you start?
Cool. Yeah, so thank you, SJ, for that lovely introduction. I figure we can first maybe talk a little bit about our background and essentially what we have done so far in our various capacities. So I'll start. I'm sure of, given that you're here and we've given many spiels about what we at Open at RIT do, I don't want to rehash that as much, but I do want to kind of talk a little bit about my role, because we've had a lot of different disciplines come up here and speak about their experiences, and particularly a lot of people from various parts of their institutions. And so, unlike many people within academia, I'm a staff member. I'm not a faculty. I don't teach. I don't have a PhD, although that's not always required. And in fact, I'm a student right now. I'm a graduate student. So a lot of the work that I do at Open at RIT is really focused on, the smaller day-to-day stuff, right? The community management, our team is primarily run with students. So most of our employees are students. And what I would boil our programs down to for my role is working with faculty members on helping develop communities around their various research projects and research artifacts that they're developing. And I do this by working with our student team on developing various ways of consulting with these faculty on how they can do that, providing the various skills backgrounds that our students have, such as software development, design thinking, user experience design, and technical writing. So I do a lot of that, manage some, various software development projects that we're running to develop infrastructures that our office uses, such as, a metrics and analytics system built upon Grimoire Lab, which is a chaos project. And a lot of, really thinking about how we can provide services to individual projects. So I'll stop there because I know that you can go on forever with this sort of stuff.
Sure. My name is Kendall Fortney. I am the program director for Versa, which is the OSPO at University of Vermont. We were funded by Sloan at the beginning of the year. I started about 4 months ago. We're hitting 5 at this point. For me, I've spent the last 12 years working in different startups and technology companies inside of Burlington. And I was like, oh yeah, I taught myself Python. I've used open source libraries, and started the job. I'm like, oh wow, that is just a tiny fraction of what this actually is. We're still designing, developing, and building our program, obviously, because we're still trying to figure out what exactly goes into it. But in that includes going to doing lectures at design classes, computer science classes. It includes sponsoring projects. So working with the Boston Library Consortium on a digital lending project and finding hopefully several others that we were looking at to try to develop inside education of things we're trying to figure out some of the social stuff because students are finally back in session. But hackathons, different social events, that kind of piece, as well as documentation, outreach, as well as policy changes and adjustments to help promote open source, as well as working with the Office of Innovation around tech licensing, all that kind of stuff. It's really just such a massive thing. And then working on open science stuff, what's already in place, understanding the metrics around it, developing it further and growing it from there. So at this point, and I know it's definitely going to change, that's kind of where we are. Being here is kind of cool because I get to hear what everyone else is doing too and be like, oh, that's a cool idea. I want to totally use that. And honestly, when I started, what's the first thing I did? Starting an OSPO, I Googled it, and I found these guys' website. And I found Steven. I actually like talked to Steven at the beginning. I was like, "That's really cool. That's super helpful." And the definition of what open was radically expanded because of talking to Steven and be like, "Oh yeah, it can be a lot more." And it really changed how I approached the problem of what we're trying to do.
Hi, yeah. I've actually been at UCSC for University of California in Santa Cruz. I'm sorry, just to make sure everyone gets what the acronym stands for, because a lot of people get confused with other universities nearby. But I've actually been there since 2016, and I'd be remiss to kind of not talk a little bit about what we did between 2016 and when we got started the OSPO project, once we got funded by Sloan. And that was for the Center for Research in Open Source Software, which is actually separate from what will hopefully be our OSPO established infrastructure within the University of California in Santa Cruz. And possibly the University of California writ large, if that is actually the hope. But a short history for CROSS, for those who don't know us, and that's really where we gained a lot of the experience that we are using now. And we really built upon what we did at CROSS. And that was, CROSS was started in 2015 based on a very generous gift from Sage Weil, who created Ceph while he was a PhD student at UCSC. And he gave the grant to our director, Carlos Maltzon, in the hopes of really recreating a situation so other students could do what he did, which was create an open source software program while he was a PhD student, and then develop it into something as successful as Ceph. Long story short. So he gave us $2 million to do that in 2015. I came in 2016 and started helping, kind of similar to what Michael was saying, which was helping kind of the day-to-day activities, but also starting to create the communities around the projects that we were supporting. And that's really where we gained, like I said, gained that experience. And we see the OSPO, and also we worked a lot with industry. So industry partners were how we're making this sustainable. So we raised another $2.6 million from industry. And we kind of saw how that was super important for us to translate all the activities that we were doing and make it more sustainable, and also expand it and scale it. So what we started to realizing that the OSPO was probably a really good, and something like an open source program office was something that we really needed to do in order to really scale it and make it more campus wide. And so we started talking to people like Steven and OSPO++ group and realizing like, hey, this is kind of the way we should be going. And even though we've kind of been doing OSPO-ish type activities, the fact that we were in a research center was not allowing us to expand as much as we wanted. So we saw a couple of gaps that we could definitely fill if we were able to create more of an OSPO, which included training for students, really increasing this industry academic collaboration, but also something we think is very important. It's actually a metric for us for our OSPO, our movement towards an OSPO, which is really understanding the value of open source to academia. And that's a big part of, I think, what we're looking for. And just to talk a little bit about activities that we're doing, and one in particular that I think is important, and we can maybe talk about a little bit more in the Q&A, is that we have an incubator program that's similar to what we had at CROSS that helps postdocs kind of create their communities around their open source projects. And we already have two great postdocs. One is Oscar Ellick, who is working on the Polyform project, which is a visualization. I always screw this up, so I have to actually read it. It visualizes the cosmos through algorithms inspired in the behavior of slime molds. And I know that sounds strange. Nice. And for me, as a social science major, I always have that, or someone who came out of the social sciences, I was always like, But when what comes out of it in the community, what the community's been able to do with those algorithms have been amazing. And I'm gonna post some slides to give people a little bit better information on that. So you can see what all the great work he's done. And then also Emily Lovell, she's actually working to strengthen underserved segments of the open source pipeline, which we, from an educational perspective, find really important. Also talk a little bit in detail, probably doing the Q&A, but we have an open source research experience that is heavily based on the Google Summer of Code. Thank you, GSOC. And that's one of the big programs we're working on to really expand our work throughout the UC system as well, because many of our mentors come from other UCs. Actually, we have 4 campuses working with us this year. The first year we've had it be a multi-campus activity. And we're also finding, and I think all of us will agree to this, that there's a lot more funding opportunities coming up this last year that we all kind of are focusing on, not just NSF, but some other stuff as well. So, and that's it.
And we have been successfully joined via internet by John Whelan at Trinity. Welcome, John.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, we're getting there. There's a little.
Yeah. Sorry. Actually, what happened? My dog ran away. I had to go find her, but we got her. Sorry.
It's all good. You're coming
Yeah.
right in. So,
Yeah.
so tell us a little bit about your entity at Trinity, John, and how it came about and what it does.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I'm not there. I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, so at Trinity College, Dublin, University of Dublin, we only set up our OSPO about 2 years ago, but I was talking to some people in OSPO movement, and we realized, well, we actually have an OSPO anyway, because we have been doing a lot of open source stuff. Just to be clear, I work in the technology transfer office. So I kind of, for a lot of people in the open source community, in the past, we'd be the big, the bad people that are trying to police what they're doing with IP. But I came from startup background. I had raised venture capital a couple of times in my own software companies. And I was a programmer myself, a developer. So I knew about the power and value of open source, and we had always been using it. And so we had some spin outs. So over the last 10, 12 years, about 12 years ago, we spun out our first company from Trinity College, which was based on an open source license. So we basically allowed a lot of research. It was based on software defined radio, and it's a company called Software Radio Systems that's still going very well, actually expanding, doing a lot of work in the US actually. And they had built the whole software radio stack about 12 years ago. And we allow them to license that and build their business on open source. So really my mission has always been to embrace open source and convince researchers in computer science, in software engineering, that technology transfer people are aware and understand open source and can work with it. And educate, we've educated ourselves, but we have a duty to educate the researchers as well. Open source is great, but there are some things you need to be aware of. The usual stuff we all know about copyright versus copyleft, restrictive versus permissive. And, that's an ongoing thing. We spun out another company 2 or 3 years ago, Terminus X, which is a non-relational database, graph database, so all open source. And so we built a culture of working with researchers and using open source in the classic way, as open as necessary. I'm sure you've heard this at this event, as open as can be, but as secure as necessary. So we have to take into account, if companies have if we do a lot of collaborations with industry in Trinity. It's one of our key targets. And, sometimes they don't want to open source. Sometimes they do. Increasingly, they do. We work with their OSPO. So that's just a brief summary of where we are and what we've been doing. There's a lot going on, and I'm really interested to hear the questions and talk to my peers here and talk about some of the challenges that we have. So thank you.
Okay. So we've heard from John that he's in tech transfer. Open at RIT lives under the auspices of the Vice President of Research. Chris told us that morning that she is often the only librarian in the world, but in the room, sorry, not in the world. Chris and I are both members of that higher education leadership in open scholarship that the National Academies has spun up. And man, there's a ton of librarians who are the presidential representatives because as Chris alluded to around licensing and journals and open educational resources, the library world has been in many ways I think somebody called it the tip of the sphere as far as universities goes. Where, Stephanie and Kendall, where are yours located in the structure and how does that affect what you do?
At the moment, we're still under our School of Engineering. Ultimately, we hope to, well, originally our view was that we wanted to be in the Office of Research, and we still basically intend that. We are intending that, and that is our ultimate goal. And we see ourselves kind of fitting between kind of tech transfer and our research development. So, but at the moment, we're considered still a research project under the Office of Research. But and we can talk a little bit. I think we're going to talk about challenges and stuff. And we had actually intended to kind of start a little bit quicker under the Office of Research, but kind of changes in personnel that happen in universities and elsewhere in the world kind of has made it, and it's still something that we're moving towards, but it's been a little bit slower than we had planned.
Okay.
Yeah, and for us, we're underneath the library and the College of Engineering, Mathematics, and Statistics. Like we're kind of a cross connect between the two. Like I have my office in the ground floor of the library, so it kind of mixes them both.
All right, so Stephanie said challenges.
Oh, challenges. Okay. Kind of, I think one challenge that I was just alluding to was what can happen if you have, and this is true in any organization, and I'm not going to, and I actually am pretty impressed with UCSC at the way in which this challenge hasn't been as large as I would have expected it. But changes in personnel, changes in champions, possibly within an organization. We got our start at Cross, and a lot of folks were like, "What are you think you're doing? I mean, this is never going to work." Open source. Yeah, they were kind of like what I think has been described by a number of other panelists about kind of the resident, or concerns about open source within academia. But we actually had a pretty, because of Ceph and because of $2 million, it was a little bit easier to kind of get the interest and get some support. And one person in particular was our previous Vice Chancellor of Research. And when he left, and now he's actually going up to the president's office, to the UCOP, or University of California President's Office. We did see a little bit of a change. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't that we weren't getting as much, weren't getting supported. Our Office of Research is still very supportive. Our text transfer group is actually very supportive in comparison to other groups. But it was kind of starting a little bit at square one on certain aspects of our assumptions about where we were sitting and how we were going. Nothing's really changed about the work. But I think related, but we do find, like, we see that, okay, this wasn't as a shoo-in as we thought it was going to be. But one issue as well, and I think it's connected to that, is the stovepiping, and I think a lot of people have alluded to this, but the way in which different departments really don't necessarily intermix, and I don't think my university is alone in this, but the outreach to say those who may see themselves working in open, be it open source or open scholarship or any of the type, or open work or whatever, however you want to name it, that it's been harder to reach out to them, I think, with interdisciplinary than I had expected when we kind of started. And we're getting there, and it's, doing things like we're having a larger symposium coming up in a couple of weeks, and the idea of that is also to bring in more folks from within UCSC, within other UCs. So yeah, so I think to me those are the challenges, and just getting the word out and feeling like we're finding all the people that we need to find.
I think for University of Vermont has been a great community to talk to. Like anyone I have gone to, because I've talked to about 60 people so far in the last 4 months, and across I think I had like 10. I think across 7 of the colleges, and man, all the offices that exist in the world, and they're all engaged, excited, Like, this is cool. I'm glad you're here. Man, I wish I had you a month ago. Like, that's been incredibly positive. I think some of the systematic understanding has been really difficult. Like, not being academic, not being someone that's gone through a PhD, like understanding the ecosystem of academia, understanding incentives, structures, funding, money. Oh man, that is like a trip and a half. So like all those things kind of tie into like the sustainability of my program. I can get, a handful of people that are excited about the concepts and are willing to put some energy now, but if I want this thing to last more than a year, like I need those larger systems to work well. And that's definitely like something I'm feeling my way through. And I think every place is a little bit different and kind of the same. And then the second part, I think, is the idea of the inclusion part of it. Having worked in many different startups, like I know the cultures that can be there, and I know how they can be bad. And how do you actually bring people in? Like my background is fine arts. I didn't go to school for computer science. So like, how do I bring people like me into these programs to get them engaged and excited? Because open is so much more than just writing code. It's like my job previously was a product manager. That is a valuable skill, and you think you can do an open source in all sorts of ways. Like there's a lot of places where people exclude themselves automatically, and breaking down those barriers of self-exclusion to allow themselves in and to make that space comfortable and easy for them is, I think, probably something that we all work on in any of our communities. And it is also a really fun project. I mean, like, honestly, you got to create cool ideas, cool games, cool events, like figure that out. But it is definitely an element of what we're tackling. We're trying to do that.
Yeah, I agree. 100%. Like, yeah, really well said. And I would certainly echo all the things that you have all said. And it's interesting, you ask what are the challenges, right? And I was thinking back to a lot of the subjects that were discussed during the first meeting today, right? Because, when you work in academia, policy challenges are a very large thing as well. And I'm like, all right, where are the challenges that I feel like we face maybe on a more ground level? And, I've been really lucky in this role to have a chance to talk to so many faculty. And we have I'd say RIT is a fairly large institution.
19,000 students and probably about 2,000 faculty and staff, I think.
Yeah. And, RIT is my alma mater. So I went through the open source program. I got the minor with SJ and everything like that. And so in this role, I've had a great opportunity to try to talk to a lot of faculty about their experience and what open means to them. And, why do they want to do it? Why don't they do it? And I realized faculty have like 6 different jobs. You're a faculty member and it's like, okay, yeah, you teach, but you also develop curriculum, right? But you also got to do research, but you also got to get grant funding for all your research. So you're kind of like selling it, right? But you also got to go to committee meetings, right? But you also got to like do grading, which I guess is a whole other thing that haunts my nightmares at night, where I dream of myself having to do that one day. And so, you have all these different jobs and you're being evaluated for all of them, right? And there's all these competing responsibilities. And every single faculty member I talk to, it's like they're being pulled in a million different directions, right? And they love every bit of it, right? They love teaching, they love like researching and all these things, right?
Nobody loves grading. Nobody
loves grading. That's true. Yeah, there's some parts of it, and I don't think anyone loves committee either, from what I've heard. But whatever. And most everyone I talk to sees the virtue in sharing, right? But they're terrified. They're absolutely terrified of the commitment, because as anyone who knows, Marie was saying very well about the factor of burnout in community management or in open source in general, right? And having that commitment. And that has been the biggest hurdle that I have encountered, is figuring out how to lower that burden, right? How to make sure that those things are actually resourced properly, whether it's by the university or by writing it into your grant funding for research, and teaching people that that's possible and how to do it and what words you use and what type of people you hire for it. And and seeing that process through all the way to the end. And so, one of our biggest things that we've done over the last year is this fellowship program where we're providing consulting for growing open source communities, right? And it's been a little bit of a roller coaster ride, but I think one of the biggest successes that I've seen in terms of overcoming that struggle recently, I know I'm probably going beyond the scope of the question, but is, we had this project that came to us, right? And they're like, we want our it's a digital humanities project. They're like, we want our website to be more accessible to people who want to contribute data and stuff, and they're developing curriculum and they want that to be more accessible. And so we had this immensely talented team of designers that worked with them. They did, a full design process. They were interviewing educators of the project and so on. And they put together this amazing, it was like a 50-slide presentation of all their design recommendations from all the work that they've done. And we handed it off to them. They're like, oh my God, this is so much work. Where are we going to do it? And we're like, I don't know, write it into a grant, right? And the next semester, they get this great grad student, it's me, but who was getting some college credit to work on it and implement it. And, when talking with the people running the project, I think something really clicked inside of them in terms of understanding like the steps of the process, right? The things that you need to do, and then like how you can resource people to do those things, and educating people on how to do it in like a very, very hand-holding way. It's really resource intensive to do it, but I would say it's like an investment that pays off. So I'll stop my spiel there, but that's what I've struggled with.
John, you're up.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I brought up challenges, because it's everything has challenges, and it's good in this kind of forum to talk about the challenges so we can learn from each other. But I don't want to be too negative. But I think the key challenge is what I mentioned about education. That coming from technology transfer, knowledge transfer offices, we can't educate researchers. That's not our job. Although it is, but they're the educators, they're the teachers, they're the lecturers, they're the academics. So it's difficult to explain, and they use open source, but they don't understand the complexities and the risks, and that's the real challenge, really, to build that trust and build that mutual respect that they will listen to what we're saying, and not when it comes through policy. We add open source and try to explain our policy in open source in our IP policy that every academic signs up when they join the institution, but it's still difficult sometimes, because it's not something that you can just explain. There's some legals in it. I'm not a lawyer, they're not lawyers, but there are legal implications that we have to try to explain, and we just try to avoid like the challenges that still happen. And I'm being open in saying this, but we still have researchers will put up software on the web for free, which is fine but they won't have any license attached to it. And that still happens. And we had a case recently where a US company out of Duke University actually came to us looking for a license for some software that their researchers had downloaded because it was just freely available, and they realized under IP due diligence that the IP was still held by Trinity College. So we were very glad to give them a license. But they're the kind of practical things that happen. Other issues, I could talk an awful lot about, and it's very Eurocentric, but the European Union, who funds billions of euro every year on research, on academic research, their very complex agreements don't really deal with open source properly. They try to, but they don't use the language that everybody's used to. So you have to try to wade through it and explain. But it would solve the whole thing with the European Union with these huge, there's these huge projects, maybe 5 million average projects would be very common. And there would be 10 or 20 partners, large companies, SMEs, research institutions, all working together, collaborating, which is great. But how do you manage the IP in a project like that, the software? And open source is a great vehicle for that. And that hasn't really been, happened within the Commission. The European Commission is obviously a bit of a slow behemoth to implement changes like that. And then really, I wouldn't mind talking to people here, but here's the biggest problem that I have every month. And it's the usual problem where somebody comes and you've asked them, our software disclosure form asks, have you used open source in the project, and please list it, and please list the license. And then we're spinning out a company, we're spinning out a campus company. They're going through tech due diligence and IP due diligence with the venture capitalist, and suddenly they find, oh, there's some GPL there's some copy left in there, and that it could be fine, it could be easy to be swapped out. But the problem I have technically and legally is where does that become a problem? I think this is the biggest problem in open source at a very practical level. When do you say that this copy left has contaminated the system? I hope using that emotive word. Where do you draw the line? Have they just used it as a platform? Is it when it's compiled with the code? Is it when if it's LGPL? Is it okay that's linked separate libraries? That's usually okay, but it's hard to get a straight answer and I'm asked to give advice on that before the company spins out, before they go to IP due diligence. And should they go to the effort of swapping out the GPL, or are they okay? That's kind of, I'm getting very specific there about a problem that we come up against all the time. But I'd be really interested to hear from other people if they have a solution. I know there are software solutions that you can plug in and throw at it, but I find the reports they give out are very complex, and you need more consultancy from the software providers to understand the report really as to what it means. So there are the challenges, starting at a high level right down to some very specific challenges that I have to deal with.
Thanks, John. I'm going to provide some translation for those who don't live in the open source world. Is there anyone here who does not understand Creative Commons licensing? Okay. So you all know that when you go to get a Creative Commons license, it's fairly simple. It's a couple of little questions. That's, like, do you want people to be able to reuse your work? Do you want people to be able to commercially use your work, right? We'll just keep it at that. Everybody with me so far? So the problems with open source software in particular is, as was alluded to earlier today, there's a lot of different licenses. And what happens in open source software more than a lot of the Creative Commons stuff is that people are pulling chunks of different things and making new things out of them. If you're a humanities person, you address this in the term bricolage, that the open source software development is really bricolage. So you are pulling different pieces from different places, and different ones of them may say different things, right? They may say you have to distribute the source code, i.e. the software that gets written by hand or generated by a computer that is editable and changeable, versus the program that you run. And this distinction is one of the reasons why Creative Commons initially said, don't use our licenses for software. Go find real open source software licenses. So there are many shades, way more than 50 shades of gray in open source licenses these days. And when people pull stuff together without paying attention to it and take this source code and this source code and this source code and fuse it into a new program that runs, right? They take clay from different places and they put it in a kiln, and now it's a hardened object, right? If they haven't paid attention to the licenses, you can get into trouble. And that's where the compliance piece that we talked about comes in, right? That, oh, well, this piece said anyone can do whatever they want with it. This piece said you've got to redistribute the original executable source code. But this one doesn't. And so now what do we have to do? Well, we're not allowed to distribute the source code with this one, and we have to distribute the source code with this one, and they're both pieces of a new thing. Does that make sense to everybody? And so what John is talking about is that problem. He's talking about the GPL, which is one of the general public license, which is one of the original free software license, which was a copyleft license. A copyleft license means that generally everything is shareable and everything must be shared, which means it's very difficult to commercialize often because people either it explicitly said, don't commercialize this, or it said, you can commercialize this, but some of those other Lego bricks or pieces of clay may say, I don't want you to commercialize this. And so this is the challenge of open source software development in the academic and in the research world. And John mentioned software packages. There are both software packages and human consultancies that will kind of look at all those different pieces and all those different licenses to try to help untangle that Gordian knot, and they do better or worse jobs of doing it. John, is that a fair description of what you were talking about?
Yeah, I apologize that you had to translate. As I'm not there physically, I'm not sure what the audience, if I was there having coffee with you and having been at the other talks, I would know what the audience was like. So yeah, that's fantastic.
No need
That's
to
fantastic.
apologize.
Yeah, thank you.
And I would add, I've done this at companies with dealing with data science where like there's a bunch of work done and you have to understand what are all the licenses and all the packages they used. Do we have a problem with liability?
Yeah, liability. And let's lead into, whether your academic open source entity, whether it's responsible for compliance. Mike's and mine is not, because I said in our charter, I would in no way, shape, or form be responsible for compliance because I hate it. And that my charter actually says, I will advise the university on who to talk to. Kat, is that a hand in the air for a comment or question? And a bill of materials is a manufacturing term where you break down all of the pieces of the thing, in this case, all of the bricks that comprise the software. Thank you, Kat.
Just for the folks on the Zoom and John, what she said is the US government is released some policy. I'm going to paraphrase here because I'm terrible at remembering words, but the US government has released some policy here requiring that people record their software bill of materials and have some sort of accountability for that. Did I get that right? Standards, right. Yeah.
Okay, so compliance for those of you who have not spoken.
So far, no.
Kind of. We are ultimate because we work very closely with our Office of Research, even though we're still not under them. When we have a license or compliance issue, we have a specific person with a legal background within the university that we talk to directly. And this has been since we were across as well. We would interact, but our faculty have kind of learned to come to us to ask the question, and then we work with that person. So it's kind of yes, but it's still we still go, okay, they're the lawyer over there, and then we also, because we have a great advisory board which includes a couple lawyers, we also bump it to them often, and then they will advise us, and then we'll let our tech transfer and our legal folks know what their opinion is. And then that way they can, and then kind of between all of that, yes, we are involved with those questions, but we're not the deciding factor. Let's put it that way.
Having you said that is kind of like triggered something. One of the things that we're trying to do is like explain what licenses are to staff and faculty. And it's not like we're trying to sit there and be like, did you do the right one? Or what are you currently using? More just like, if you want to use the licenses, what does the license mean? That stuff, which is a little bit easier.
Yeah, and I thought I would throw this out there. I was reading a report, the Omidyar network and with an organization called Demos, released this report called the Open Roads Report. And in that report, if you're interested, I encourage you to Google it. They sort of talk about this dichotomy between open and open in terms of liability and open in terms of virtue. And so they started talking about programs around open and various offices and organizations that are trying to, do open, but oftentimes they're organized in one of these two groups, right? They're either really interested in liability, in making sure that, their supply chain is secure, or that when people are releasing products that they are, licensed properly and that they aren't invalid, compromising any other licenses that they're using. There's other organizations that are more interested in open in terms of it being a virtue, right? We feel like it's a value of ours and we need to think about doing things openly because it's like a core part of our organization and we're trying to educate people on how to do it. And oftentimes these organizations, we've had people come up here all day sort of saying like, oh, each OSPO is its kind of own thing. And I think that's true because, in this report, they laid it out and people focusing on doing open as a liability are oftentimes doing the same activities as those interested in doing it as a virtue, but they're doing it in very different ways. And I think one thing that maybe I wish that we considered a little more deeply as, I think we landed very much on one side of it, starting our organization. But if you're thinking about starting yours and where you fit organizationally within your institution, thinking about what side of that you feel like you want to be on, and then what sort of like other parts of your institution would be more focused on doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, just to amplify that a little bit. So what we've done at Open at RIT has a best practices section of the website. And we can't tell anybody to do anything. And as I alluded to earlier today, nobody can tell faculty to do anything ever. But so licensing is a piece of what we recommend, right? We recommend certain licenses, and that's not just for software, that's for open hardware, which is kind of in a weird world where it's a license or a certification process, all the way down, Creative Commons license and all these things. We say we can't tell you you have to do this, but we recommend this to you specifically because it protects you and it protects your work. So it's not, we are not trying to limit you in what you do, just in the way that you'll be told often, set up a corporation for whatever you do so you are legally protected, right? Go set up an LLC. So if you're putting something out there, whether it's music or art or technology, that you can't be held liable for something that goes wrong, right? So this is a similar idea. And sometimes people gravitate and understand to that kind of explanation that it's for their benefit. We're trying to help them protect themselves.
And there's elements that are like, some licenses are more recognized as common, and there's ones that aren't recognized by, I think it's OSI, thank you. And I was talking to someone recently about these like new licenses that people are writing around like ethics, like you literally, the license actually has like, you can't do evil with my stuff kind of concepts. And that's like a whole different world of like, how is that enforced? What does that mean? It starts a conversation, but like, what does that actually do kind of thing?
Yes, Justin Flory, wave your hand. Justin Flory is very involved in the ethical source license world, or at least a little bit. He's nodding his head yes or no. He's who I go to talk about ethical source licenses. So you might get some discussion from him if you have an interest in that.
I just want to check on time.
Yes, I've been looking at I think we've got about 10 minutes left. Let me look at my handy pocket thing. Yeah, we have 13 minutes left. So questions from the audience? Are we ready to entertain some of those? Yeah, I will actually circulate the mic if that helps.
Thank you. This morning we heard that OSPO people working on open work in universities are balancing between different sources of power, up the administrators up on high and like the grassroots from below. I'm wondering what the relationship is with your offices, with the faculty senate, student government, student unions, this kind of thing.
We haven't had as much interaction with this on the kind of student organizations. We're trying, we've done a little bit. We like work with some cruise hacks, which is very student focused. It's a hackathon at Santa Cruz that focuses on undergraduates. We have activities that are focusing on generally on undergraduates, but not specifically UCSC undergraduates, like our open source research experience program. We've mainly been working with we're mainly coming, I don't want to say coming from the top, because I feel like we work within the graduate student population a lot, and within their faculty advisors, particularly within the School of Engineering right now. And then the hopes is that that expands. Sorry, that's a little bit more cross, but and then the OSPO is, sorry, I wear two hats, so sometimes I forget which way when I'm going on. So on the OSPO side, we are focusing a lot on our focus is really on the incubator project we have, which focuses on postdocs. And so we're trying to get faculty who have postdocs that are working on these open source projects. And so that's kind of the area we're focusing on. But yeah, we're also really have a lot of focus on our Office of Research, our Vice Chancellor, and those folks to kind of get the political support as well for a lot of the activities we're doing. And so far we've had pretty good luck with those levels. The idea, I really do think that moving forward, particularly as we focus more on building tools for students, or giving students the possibility of building more tools using open source, I will definitely be focusing a lot more on some of the undergraduate focused groups as well. But right now we're kind of still in the working with faculty, postdocs, and then administration. And also within the School of Engineering, hopefully going beyond that. So
At least for me, my beginning at UVM was only a couple weeks before the end of the session. So like we're now finally getting back into school, and some of those organizations are meeting again. And I hope to be talking to some of them. I think part of the things that I've kind of seen and in my approach to it is making sure I've been talking to faculty before I go into those meetings, making sure I've talked to students. Like the goal is not to be going to that meeting and have like none of them know who I am. And to walk in with some things like, hey, we've done these things. This is why this is valuable to you. I think if I, walk into the meeting, I'm like, I'm doing this thing. It doesn't mean anything to you yet. And you don't know any of you yet. Like that's not going to go as well as actually having some tendrils of connections and some relevancy to them. And that's been what we're kind of building to. And I hope to have that in a place that I can go to those meetings later in this month or next. It may end up being in the fall as it gets to that point, but we'll see.
So, I mean, I think the first obvious thing that we would think about in terms of our interaction with students is curriculum. Steve Jacobs has done an amazing job developing a very comprehensive undergraduate curriculum towards open that I think is fairly accessible to multidisciplinary students from all backgrounds. But, when I was a little boy, doing my undergraduate degree, there was this very awesome person who is with us today, Mr. Remy de Cosmaker, who was working at RIT running the open source programs back then. And back then our programs were actually very, very focused purely on our student population. Whereas now, a lot of our programs are focused on research, right? It's kind of the nature of our funding and what we're trying to make. A lot of the work that we're doing is around research. And so I think our curriculum was something really special, but particularly when I was doing my undergraduate degree, there was a very, very real and substantial community that wasn't necessarily purely centered around the curriculum. Obviously, it was heavily integrated, but it was also a kind of an autonomous student community. It wasn't a club. It wasn't like a student government. It was just this weird sort of network of hackers on IRC that were really into open, that were discovering things themselves that, I think, even the faculty were learning things from. And that was truly a special thing. And I think it's you know, when we think about how we like, okay, well, what are we doing for the students? It's also like, how are we resourcing these programs for the students, right? Are we providing physical space for them? Are we providing dedicated infrastructure? Are we providing, you know, a human who's there on campus always to provide the center of gravity? I think a lot of people sort of are like, oh, well, you know, if we have like a center or whatever, they're doing things, and the students, they can like do stuff. But really organizing, just like with any open source community, you kind of need a community manager that's running events, that's focusing on it, that's thinking about it all day long. And, you know, I think that's something that I've seen a lot of, not to like put everything on funders, but I've seen a lot of funding opportunities kind of coming about for saying like, well, we want researchers working together. And like, I've seen a little bit of stuff around like, okay, we should have curriculum, right? But I would say a very, very important thing that I don't see or hear about very often is the idea of creating student communities, like, you know, in a way, the same way as open source communities within academic institutions. You can go ahead, John.
John, Mike is holding the microphone out to you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. You know, look, in fairness, I think we all realize that universities, well, particularly a 430-year-old institution where I work, is dysfunctional, really, when it comes to governance. But the mechanism that we use, quite simply, I mentioned it earlier, is the intellectual property policy, which is, you know, it's an important document within the institution. So that's where we deal with open source, really. And anytime it is mentioned, for the last 10 years, it's been in our IP policy document, which is approved by all the various committees in the university. And actually, we update it every 5 years, so it's going through the rounds now, and it's going through all the various committees. So it does get approved ultimately by board, which is the governing body of the institution. So that it is, at least it's a painful process, but at least then it's kind of cast in stone. And what we say about open source is the policy officially, so we can always refer to it. And basically what we say is that we are very friendly towards open source. We support open source, but there are cases based on the funding mechanism where the research is being funded that we have to be aware of and be conscious of some potential risks. Actually, another point that's just reminded me, another point I wanted to make while I'm talking, I know we're just still have 4 minutes left, is another challenge is open, and it's touched on a lot here today, is open science, open access, and open source are very related within an institution, within the governance of an institution, but they're not quite the same thing. You know, there are some important differences, and that's another challenge, because people hear the word open and say, oh, you know, the university's policy is open access journals. The big funding agencies for science in Ireland have said all the science should be published in open access journals. And then people read that to say, oh, that means I can open source everything in that project, but industry may be involved. So, you know, that's another, back to the education challenge again. But thanks for that question. Yeah, it's a good question.
Stephanie?
Yeah, what Mike was talking about actually jarred something in my brain as well. We do focus a lot on the research impact, so that's why faculty and postdocs are particularly important to us. But one thing that particularly our incubator project, as well as other projects we're working on with some of our PhD students, is focusing on creating more curriculum. And because you're bringing up what you do at OpenRIT. And I think that that's something that we're specifically focusing on, and with, especially since we started the OSPO process, and having our incubator fellows actually be also creating courses around their incubator projects, and kind of following earlier courses we had with regards to that working on open source programming. So that's something that's really kind of a huge push as well within our OSPOs to create more opportunities, and not just under the CSE, like our computer science and engineering program, but also under like computational media and other programs as well. So kind of broaden that out, and then so reach more of the undergraduate community.
Right, and Raya, just to kind of circle back to the parts of your question that didn't get touched on, if and when we want to convert our best practices to policy, it'll have to go through academic senate, staff council, and student council for approval, and then back up to the institute council, if that helps. And with that, we have 2 minutes left. Who wants to get one in really quick? I see Karsten has a hand up.
I'm going to take something from what John and Stephanie was saying. So, excuse me. So I know in Cross, one of my favorite hacks that y'all came up with is the University of Californians are famous for intellectual property licensing, right? And because it's open source, we can't do that same kind of thing. I'm sorry, we're in another direction and managed to kind of make a feint for the lawyers and move this way and create an entire world in that little niche, right? So I'm curious, and then same thing over here, I'm hearing it at Trinity, they're going through the process of formalizing. What are some of the ways in which the IP policies of your institutions have helped and hindered your process, and other hacks you've thought of?
Well, yeah, I was gonna say we've been able to actually write open source into our grant letters. Term for it, it's our open source sponsorship agreement is what we're calling it, and it's great because we actually put within. So this is between industry and a researcher at UCSC, and it's. I mean, it's worked with UCSC, and then it's something that we hope to run out through the rest of the UCs. And basically, it just says we intend to open source anything that comes out of this grant, anything that's funded by this grant. And just that word, the intention, and this is the way people were like, oh, this is never going to work. And it's like, but that intention, and this is similar to our member agreement under CROSS and what we're promoting for other research institutes, research centers to do. It's really that intention in and of itself is enough for industry to be like, okay, we want to work with you. We want it to be open sourced for whatever reason that they see is important. And that intention is there. And our, like I said, UCSC's tech transfer folks and our IP folks are actually very willing to work with us on that. And they're the ones who came up with the language that works and that we've used a number of occasions. So.
I mean, and the same for UVM in certain ways, like the tech transfer office is like literally on our advisory board, and they're excited. They're like, they want this to happen. They're like, sometimes the IP battles are not worth the time, not worth the money. Like, it's more valuable to actually get the stuff out and used, especially because like UVM is a land grant institution. So like that's important for the college to actually have that out. So, right. Like it's like they find it valuable, and even, like trying to bring the conversation around licensing and what they want to do with the research, like earlier into the process of doing that work is like what I want to do is get in the beginning. So when they get to the end, they already know what they're going to do. They've built it around the concept, like, oh, I need to share this. Well, how do I share it? What does it look like? What do I need to add to it? Like that part needs to happen a lot earlier than what we're going to do at this point. But that's part of like understanding that. And I think that's going to change a lot of like the environment that you're in if you can get earlier in that process and have it always be part of the conversation.
Steve has said this earlier, but RIT's got a pretty lax IP system or IP policy. So students own all their IP. It's not necessarily the case with faculty, but it hasn't been so restrictive that it's really been a problem with anything that we've encountered. So most of the difficulties are kind of past that for us. John?
Yeah, well, under Irish European law, universities own the IP as your employer owns your IP, but students, no, we don't. Except for grad students, we don't own the IP of undergrads, but grad students, if they receive a stipend, we own their IP, and that's kind of government and European policy. But at a high level, the problem, it's a challenge it's a polarization, unfortunately, of society and in open source, and between the dreaded word left, right, copyright, copy left, and that just leads to polarization, and people think it means one thing and that copyleft is great and copyright is bad, and it's not as simple as that. They're both very valuable. So I won't get too esoteric, but that's what I think at a very high level is where it stands. And we're just trying to bridge that gap like everybody is.
Thank you, everyone.